The Lord said to Moses and Aaron in Egypt, "This month is to be for you the first month of your year. Tell the whole community of Israel that on the 10th day of this month, each man is to take a lamb for his family, one for each household. If any household is too small for a whole lamb, they must share one with their nearest neighbor, having taken into account the number of people there are. You are to determine the amount of lamb needed in accordance with what each person will eat. The animals you choose must be year-old males without defect, and you may take them from the sheep or the goats. Take care of them until the 14th day of the month, when all the members of the community of Israel must slaughter them at twilight. Then they are to take some of the blood and put it on the sides and tops of the door frames of the houses where they eat the lambs. That same night, they are to eat the meat roasted over the fire, along with bitter herbs and bread made without yeast. Do not eat the meat raw or boiled in water, but roast it over a fire with the head, legs, and internal organs. Do not leave any of it until morning. If some is left till morning, you must burn it. This is how you are to eat it, with your cloak tucked into your belt, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand. Eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. On that same night, I will pass through Egypt and strike down every firstborn of both people and animals. And I will bring judgment on all the gods of Egypt. I am the Lord. The blood will be a sign for you on the houses where you are. And when I see the blood, I will pass over you. No destructive plague will touch you when I strike Egypt."
Thank you, Helen. Good morning, everybody. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Ailey. I'm an ordinand going into my final year of training, so that means I'm training for ministry with the Scottish Episcopal Church. It's really nice to be with you at the midday service. I'm usually at the 10 o'clock, so it's lovely to have an excuse to come along here today. I wonder if you've been to the cinema recently, if you might have seen either of these films. There's been a lot of media attention about them, and they probably sit at either end of a spectrum. So you've got Barbie and Oppenheimer, and you might be somebody that enjoys the light-hearted comedy of Barbie, or you might be somebody who really enjoys wrestling with a gritty plot line as an Oppenheimer. One review that I read of Oppenheimer said it was a 3-hour ordeal. That sounds like something that's not very appealing to me, but it might be something that you really relish. Plot lines. I wonder how we handle difficult stories. And are you somebody who, when you go to the cinema and find something you don't like, maybe hide behind your hands? Or when you're reading a book that you find challenging, you might skip a few pages until it all gets a bit lighter again? Or are you somebody who really does enjoy grappling with a gritty story? The Passover is a bit of a gritty story, and it's a challenging one to engage with. And I'm tempted, my natural default would be to celebrate the good thing about the Passover, that the Israelites, they ended up free, and we can just focus on that, and it's all nice and happy. But it's just not that simple, because as the Passover tells the story of freedom, physical freedom from slavery, it's also the story of the final plague. And that final plague is a plague of death. So on the night of the Passover, every house in Egypt would be visited by death. And in the morning, it was either going to be a lamb that had died or a firstborn son. It's a gritty plot line. It's not an easy story to think about. So today we're going to be looking at mostly the Old Testament, but we're also going to be looking into the New Testament, because while the Passover is about the people of Israel being saved, in the whole arc of Scripture, it's really speaking of God reaching out and building a covenant with his people Israel. And there are strong links of this in the New Testament. The sacrifice of this Passover lamb and the sacrifice of Jesus. Paul says that Jesus is the Passover lamb. He says that in 1 Corinthians. And Jesus himself, it was the Passover meal that he was celebrating with his disciples the night before he went to the cross. He announced to them then that he was the Passover lamb to be slain for the sins of the world. One writer has said that the Passover here in Exodus is just a shadow of Christ's Passover. So we're going to take two headings. They start with the same letter. I've done that in a bid to make us remember them, but even as I was writing this, I was struggling to remember them, so I don't know if it's helpful for you to have them beginning with the same letter or not. Forgiveness and freedom are our headings, and we'll start with forgiveness. And while we think about these words, they're positive words. We think of them as really positive things. Being forgiven is a great thing, being free, they're great. But I think we'll see this morning that the Israelites, they found it challenging. They found forgiveness challenging, and they found freedom challenging. And maybe ourselves, in our lives, we actually find these things much more challenging than we might think of initially. So forgiveness. Forgiveness is costly. Somebody always has to pay in forgiveness. And in the Old Testament, when people were seeking forgiveness from God, they would bring sacrifices and offerings. It was very much part of their everyday, normal lives. And those sacrifices, if they were bringing a lamb, you couldn't just bring the weakest lamb from your flock. You had to bring a lamb without blemish. So the sacrifice cost you something. You really notice it. Similarly, if you were bringing a grain offering or an offering of oil, you would have to bring a certain volume or weight, depending on how wealthy you were, because you had to really feel the pinch of that offering. You had to notice it. And that's true of forgiveness today. If we think about our own system, our justice system, we talk about offenders paying their debt to society. And we can put a value on that as well. So perhaps somebody will pay a fine, a monetary fine for speeding maybe. Or you might have to serve a certain time in jail. There's a price that you have to pay. And underneath that forgiveness is judgment. Before we can forgive, there needs to be some kind of assessment of what has gone wrong. So in a school, for example, a child might have broken a rule. In our society around us, an adult might have broken a law. In relationships, somebody might have broken trust, even broken a heart. There's some assessment of what's gone wrong. And judgment is front and center in this passage in Exodus this morning. God says in verse 12, I will pass through Egypt and I will pass judgment. We can't really avoid it. It's much nicer to say that God is a loving God and God is a forgiving God, rather than thinking about God as judge. We love our bake-off judges, though, and we love our Strictly judges too. And maybe we love our pottery judges and our sewing judges and all other types of television judges. We enjoy them. But we don't like when people are too judgy. There's two very different things there. And I've been thinking about the difference. Why do we love these television judges, but we don't like it when people are judgy? We perceive them to be judgy. And firstly, the judges on television, well, they're meant to be expert. So Prue Leith knows all about cooking, baking, and Craig Revel-Horwood knows all about dancing. So when they're judging, we're getting their expert opinion. So we think it's going to be fair and accurate. the judgments that are passed. But also, though, when we're watching judging on television, it's always towards other people, and they are quite far removed from us. So whether Jane from Dorset's Victoria Sponge gets slated or not has no bearing on my day today or tomorrow or the next day. It's a shame for Jane, but it has no impact on my life. I am suitably far removed from it. It's not my life that's under scrutiny. So when we think of God as being a judge, that's quite uncomfortable. Some of you will know I was a teacher a few years ago. I taught in high schools, and those of you who have been teachers will know that there's an HMIE inspector who comes out and visits schools. And a school is always told when they're going to be inspected, and these visits are meant to be really supportive and helpful. In reality, people always get very stressed out about them, but we knew that the inspectors were coming to our school, and they were going to be spending around a week in the school, speaking to various pupils, visiting classes and watching lessons, and speaking to the school leadership. And at the end of the week, I had not been visited in my classroom. And I remember we had a timetable of where the inspectors would be throughout the whole week, and we knew that at midday of this, I think it was a Thursday, it's scarred in my memory, they were stopping class visits at the midday. And I remember looking at the clock in my classroom and it was 11:15. And I thought, nice, they've not come in, so that's me. They're not coming into my class, that's great. And then at 11:18, a face appeared at the window of my door, and it was this impeccably dressed, lovely woman. I remember she had a green tweed suit on. It was very lovely. And she walked in, smiled at me, smiled at all the class, and she just quietly went up to the back of the room and she sat down to observe the rest of my lesson. And immediately, I was under scrutiny. I was being judged. My heart started hammering. Now, I was an all right teacher. I knew how to teach, but all of a sudden, because I was being judged, everything went to pot. And I could feel my voice get a bit higher and a little bit more panicked. And the lesson, it's fair to say, went up a notch. There was a little bit more enthusiasm in the room, and I was really trying to G the class up to perform for this woman. And they could see what I was doing. They were in 5th year, so they were quite old, and they were cynical enough to see exactly what was going on. So as the lesson was about to come to an end, I thought, right, she's not seen the start of my lesson, and in teaching they make a big deal about the start of the lesson, start it well and end it well. These are really strong points, really key points. So I thought, well, she's not seen how fabulously I started the lesson, so I'll need to really make sure I end the lesson on a high. So I made sure I summarised the learning points, and I looked ahead to the next lesson, what we might be doing, and I set really clear instructions for the homework. And then I said, you don't want them to be late for their next class. You want to pack up just before the bell, but not too early before the bell, because then they'll get restless. So I said, okay, everybody, if we just get our bags, pop our books away. And this girl, who actually I don't think liked me anyway, put her hand up, and the face was like this. And I thought, oh, don't spoil it now. I said, yes, question? And she said, we're here for another hour. We have a double lesson. And at that point, I thought, oh, I didn't know how to come back from that, because I had another hour of the class. And I knew that. At 11 o'clock, I had planned a double lesson. But because I was under scrutiny and I was being judged, I panicked and it all went wrong. I was terrified of a person's judgment. I could barely cope with 1 hour of my teaching life being assessed. So to think of my whole life being assessed, being under scrutiny from God, never mind my inner life, that's quite a challenge. Sometimes as humans, we pass judgments that aren't fair. We don't see the whole picture. We've not seen what's gone on before. We don't have all of the information, and sometimes our own biases will influence the judgments that we make. But God is utterly beyond our comprehension. He's holy, and his judgments are perfect. He's all-knowing, he's all-powerful, He's in all places, and he is all good. His judgments bring perfect justice. And here, at last, is the point. I hadn't noticed in this chapter before that it's not just the Egyptians who are being judged here. The Israelites are also being judged in this situation. And you think, well, why do the Israelites need judged? They're the ones being saved in this scenario. Why do they need to be judged? And it becomes apparent later on in chapter 12, sitting around verses 22, the Israelites are told not to leave their houses that night. So once they have daubed the blood of the lamb around their doorposts, they are to stay inside until morning. Because when judgment came, without the blood of the lamb, the Israelites would be found wanting. And that's quite sobering. Because the Israelites, they're God's chosen people. They're not the wicked Egyptians. These are the oppressed people in this story. They're not the oppressors. The Egyptians are away worshipping idols. The Israelites weren't. They weren't breaking rules. And yet, sin isn't about breaking rules. Sin is anything that takes the place of God, anything that inhibits our lives being lives of worship. And so as Christians, we can do all the things. We can call ourselves Christians, we can attend church, we can be baptized, we can give our money, we can be doing all the things that are expected of us. And yet something else has our heart and our passion. It might be a relationship, it might be a career, it might be a property, it might be a really good cause. It might be trying to collate that perfect capsule wardrobe. How do we know? How can we tell if something else has grabbed our heart's affection? If it's something like a relationship, that's maybe very obvious. But I wonder, when we have half an hour on our own, if we have such a thing, if we have half an hour with no deadlines, no agendas, genuine free time, where do our minds drift? Where do we find it really easy to daydream, to plot, or to scheme? What do we love thinking about? Another question is, what do we really enjoy spending our money on? Where do we find it really easy to part with our money? And these are probably good clues. Are the answers always in a Godward direction? I know that mine aren't. So the Israelites, they're not obvious sinners, maybe. We don't see them flouting rules, but like the Egyptians, they are facing judgment from a holy God. But then in verse 16, there's the promise that comes in. The blood will be a sign for you on the houses where you are. And when I see the blood, I will pass over you. No destructive plague will touch you. God offers the Israelites not an escape from judgment, but a substitute for judgment. The lamb was a substitute. And surely we think the lamb is not the worth of a child. That doesn't seem like a fair trade at all. But this sacrifice wasn't about worth. This sacrifice was ultimately a sign. And the lambs were a placeholder for what was to come in the person of Jesus. It was John in the New Testament who saw Jesus coming down the road, who shouted, "Behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world," the substitute for sin in the person of Jesus. And that takes us on to freedom, from forgiveness to freedom. Once the Israelites have been freed, we don't see them just heading straight to the promised land. Instead, they end up in the wilderness, and they're there for quite a long time, 40 years, in this kind of temporary state. And on the night of the Passover, it's not that they're just saved, full stop, end of story. In many ways, it was the beginning of their rescue story that took many twists and turns over many years before it reached a conclusion. And we see in chapter 16, the people, when they end up in the wilderness, they start to grumble. And they start complaining to Moses. And they're saying, "Oh, it was great." They harken back to when they were in slavery. They're like, "It was great there. We knew when we were getting fed. We knew what each day held. It was predictable." Because in the wilderness, they're living in the day-to-day provision of God. They're given manna to eat each day. There's this pillar of cloud by day, there's a pillar of fire by night, and it says in chapter 13 that this pillar never left its place in front of the people. God is providing for them in really tangible ways, and yet the people still don't feel that they can trust him. And I wonder how we find living the life of faith. If we're Christians this morning, we've been saved, we've been launched into this freedom with God, and yet now we're struggling to trust in his daily provision. We might revert to old habits, old routines, patterns. We don't quite trust that God has thought of all the details or that he might know what's best for us. I've got a really interesting, it's a really horrible slide coming up. Count your blessings. These are the names of a hymn I remember from when I was young. Count your blessings, name them one by one, and it will surprise you what the Lord has done. I've chosen that really naff image because I think this can be a really ridiculous and quite patronising thing to say to people sometimes. But at the same time, have we tried it? Have we tried thinking about where God has been, how God has actually provided for us? Have we thought about the things that he's brought us through? Have we thought about the things he's given us, the people that he's put in our path? And are we surprised by that? We so often just don't have time to look back and to consider where God has been and what he's done. And when I look back and see the ridiculous and kind provision of God, time and time again, and yet I struggle still to really trust that he has my tomorrow in his hands. Because living by faith is hard, and it disrupts our routines and our certainties. And the Israelites, who had been living under the regime and the lordship of Pharaoh, are now struggling to live in the freedom that God was inviting them to under his lordship. In 1 Corinthians, Paul tells the early followers of Jesus that they had been bought with a price, as a master would buy a slave. And he tells them, therefore, don't become a slave of an earthly master. He's encouraging them to submit to the lordship of God. You see, God had promised the Israelites way back in chapter 6 that he would take them out and that they would be his people. Being a Christian, it's not just a hobby, but it's a call to live under the lordship of Christ and to follow in his servant footsteps. That same verse in 1 Corinthians, Paul says that we're not our own. We don't belong to ourselves. But rather this being equal to some kind of repressive regime, it's actually freeing. I don't know if any of you have read the book by Tim Keller. Tim Keller was an American pastor. He died earlier this year, but he was a prolific writer as well. He wrote a book called The Freedom of Self-Forgetfulness. And in it he says this: the essence of gospel humility is not thinking more of myself or thinking less of myself. It's thinking of myself less. And does that not sound appealing? To be free to realize that it's not about me and my stuff and my goals and all of those things that have stolen our heart. Maybe we're not massive, rebellious rule breakers, but maybe we can see where we've allowed other gods to sneak into our lives and take the place of God. Or perhaps the God is actually me. Perhaps I trust myself to rule my life and try to control my destiny and my path rather than leaving that to God. And we'll see in future weeks as we continue in Exodus that this is exactly what the Israelites do. They find it so hard to live in God's provision, to trust that forgiveness, to trust that freedom, and they create different gods and idols which keep them wandering in the wilderness for many years. So this Passover is a story of a freed people And it speaks to us about forgiveness and freedom. And I wonder if we're able to walk in that this morning. I'll invite Rosemary up to pray for us just now. Thanks.